Danny Mercer, Craig Foster, Liam Doyle, and the Mills brothers were names whispered in fear across Liverpool's docks. Men who built an empire of crime so powerful that no one dared cross them, until betrayal and ambition tore it all apart. In the late 1990s, Liverpool was a city of sharp contrasts, rich in culture and music, yet marked by unemployment and growing crime. Beneath the noise of football stadiums and the buzz of city markets, an undercurrent of desperation ran deep. It was in this atmosphere that a man named Danny Mercer began to carve his path into history. Danny grew up in Kirkdale, a tough area where survival depended on how quickly you could adapt. From a young age, he learned that the streets rewarded those who were fearless and ruthless. What started as petty thefts, stolen cars, fake goods, and smuggling cigarettes through the docks soon evolved into something much larger. Danny wasn't like the typical street criminals who chased quick money. He had vision. He watched the city's underworld like a chessboard, planning his moves years ahead. By his mid-20s he had gathered a small circle of loyal men. Craig Foster, a sharp thinker with a calm temper, Liam Doyle, aggressive but reliable, and the Mills brothers, Sean and Eric, known for their ability to intimidate without drawing attention. Together they formed a crew that operated with precision and discipline. They called themselves the Dockside Firm. It wasn't an official name at first, just something whispered around the pubs and markets. But soon it became feared across Merseyside. Their earliest operations were small but smart. They hijacked shipments that no one would miss, moving stolen goods through hidden routes across the docks. They avoided unnecessary violence, preferring to pay off guards and dock workers instead of threatening them. It was a business, not a war. Danny believed that real power didn't come from guns, it came from control, and by the early 2000s, the Dockside Firm controlled more than anyone realized. With each successful deal, their reputation grew. They expanded from smuggling electronics and fake designer goods to more profitable ventures, drug distribution, counterfeit currency, and money laundering. Every move was calculated, every risk measured. Danny made sure no one outside the circle knew the full picture. Even the men working under him only saw fragments of the empire. The fewer people who knew, the harder it was for anyone to bring them down. Despite the crime and corruption, many locals saw Danny Mercer as a sort of protector. He donated quietly to struggling families, paid off debts for small business owners, and kept violent outsiders out of his territory. He blended charity with crime, creating a strange loyalty among the people. Some called him a villain, others whispered that he was the only man keeping worse criminals away from their streets. For nearly a decade, the Dockside Firm operated in silence. Police knew something was happening but couldn't prove it. Every lead ended in dead ends, every witness vanished, and every investigation lost momentum. Danny's operations were clean, his records hidden behind layers of fake companies and offshore accounts. He was Liverpool's ghost king, everywhere, yet invisible. But behind his calm control was a hunger that never faded. Danny wanted more money, more reach, more fear. He didn't know it then, but his ambition would become the very thing that destroyed everything he built. The empire that rose quietly from the docks of Liverpool was destined to fall, and its story was only just beginning. By the mid-2000s, the Dockside Firm had grown from a small-time crew into the most organized criminal network Liverpool had ever seen. What began in the shadows of Kirkdale now stretched across the entire city and beyond. Their control over the docks gave them a gateway to everything: drugs, weapons, counterfeit goods, even stolen cars from mainland Europe. The ports were their lifeline, and through them, the firm quietly flooded the north of England with illegal trade. Every container, every crate, and every handshake that crossed those docks carried their mark in some form. Danny Mercer sat at the top of it all, untouchable and feared. His leadership style was unlike that of other gang bosses who relied on chaos and intimidation. He ruled with a cold, calculated kind of order. Every man had a role, every job had a system. Even violence had rules. The firm avoided unnecessary killings, knowing that attention from the police was poison. Instead, they preferred control through money and influence. Dock supervisors, customs officers, and even small business owners all owed them quiet favors. Danny's money moved faster than the law could follow. The gang's finances ran through a network of legitimate fronts: nightclubs, car dealerships, property rentals, import companies. These businesses gave the appearance of success while laundering millions in dirty cash. To the outside world, Danny appeared to be a self-made entrepreneur. He dressed in tailored suits, drove expensive cars, and hosted charity events that earned him admiration from the very community he exploited. People respected him because they didn't dare to question how he earned his wealth. The Dockside Firm didn't just control the ports, they controlled fear. Rival gangs learned quickly that crossing Danny Mercer was a mistake. Those who tried to move in on his operations vanished without explanation. Some disappeared entirely. Others were found beaten beyond recognition. Yet, there were never witnesses, and never direct evidence linking the violence to Danny. That was his brilliance. He didn't need to get his hands dirty. His orders moved down through layers of men until no one could trace where they began. As their power grew, so did their confidence. The firm began expanding its reach into Manchester and Glasgow, forming quiet partnerships with other criminal groups who respected Danny's methods. He offered stability and profit, and in return, they gave him access to wider markets. Within a few years, the Dockside Firm wasn't just a Liverpool problem. It had become part of a national network of organized crime. But with growth came greed. Some of Danny's men started questioning why they should settle for a share when they helped build the empire. Tensions brewed quietly beneath the surface, though no one dared challenge him openly. The streets were full of whispers about money gone missing, shipments lost, and loyalty fading. Meanwhile, the police were slowly beginning to see a pattern. The raids on smaller gangs revealed connections leading back to the docks, and detectives started piecing together the threads that all pointed toward one name: Daniel Mercer. Still, without concrete proof, they couldn't touch him. The firm's silence was absolute, its walls unbreakable. Liverpool's underworld had never been more tightly controlled, and yet unseen cracks were beginning to form. The empire built on fear and loyalty was strong, but not unbreakable. Beneath the luxury cars and polished smiles, envy and suspicion had started to grow. Danny Mercer believed he had complete control, but every empire, no matter how powerful, eventually meets the one thing it cannot stop: betrayal. In 2011, the walls of the Dockside Firm began to tremble, though at first no one noticed the cracks forming. Danny Mercer still believed he had complete control, but within his circle, jealousy was starting to burn quietly. Among those closest to him, Liam Doyle was the most ambitious. He had been with Danny since the early days, running the riskiest routes and managing dangerous deals. Over time, he began to see himself not as a follower, but as a man who deserved equal power. Danny treated him like a trusted lieutenant, but Liam wanted to be more. He wanted his own empire, his own docks, and his own name whispered in fear. The tension between them started with money. Liam noticed that Danny was taking a larger share of the profits while the rest received fixed percentages. For years he kept quiet, believing loyalty would pay off. But when the firm expanded into new cities, the profits grew, and Danny's grip tightened. Every deal went through him, and every major decision required his approval. For a man like Liam, who had risked his life building the network, it felt like a betrayal. What Danny didn't see was how far Liam's bitterness had gone. Behind closed doors, Liam began making secret connections. Through his nightclub contacts in Manchester, he reached out to a rival gang known for their control of drug routes in the north. He offered them something no one else could: access to Liverpool's docks. In exchange, they promised him protection, men and money to build his own crew. It was a dangerous gamble, but Liam believed he was clever enough to play both sides without being caught. Over the next few months, strange things began to happen. Shipments that were always secure started getting intercepted. Police raids occurred at locations that only a handful of people knew about. Danny grew suspicious but couldn't pinpoint who was leaking information. Each time they lost a shipment, the loss amounted to hundreds of thousands of pounds. The firm's reputation for being untouchable began to fade. Danny held quiet meetings, questioning his inner circle one by one. He didn't raise his voice, but his cold stare was enough to make grown men tremble. Still, no one dared mention Liam's name. Liam was too well-liked, too deep in the system to be suspected. He played his part perfectly, pretending to be frustrated by the setbacks and even helping to plan countermeasures. All the while, he continued feeding information to the Manchester rivals, tightening the noose around his own boss. Then, without warning, Liam disappeared. One night he was at his usual bar, and the next morning, he was gone. His phones were switched off, his flat was empty, and his car was found abandoned near the docks. No one knew whether he had fled or been taken. For Danny Mercer, his disappearance confirmed what he had feared most. Someone close had betrayed him, but he had no proof, only rage and confusion. The police, meanwhile, were quietly celebrating. The information they had been receiving about the Dockside Firm's movements had come from an anonymous source. They didn't know it was Liam Doyle, but his betrayal had given them their first real chance to strike. As Danny searched for answers, his empire was already beginning to unravel. The loyalty that once held the firm together had been replaced with mistrust. For the first time, the king of Liverpool's underworld was no longer sure who was standing beside him and who was waiting to destroy him. The downfall of the Dockside Firm began slowly, almost invisibly, like a storm building far beyond the horizon. At first, the changes seemed minor. More police patrols near the docks, a few informants suddenly missing, whispers of new investigations. But soon, the quiet disruptions grew into something Danny Mercer could no longer ignore. Raids began hitting their operations with alarming accuracy. 2 major shipments were seized in a single month, each worth millions. That had never happened before. Someone was feeding information to the authorities, and Danny knew it couldn't just be bad luck. Inside the firm, paranoia spread like wildfire. Every man started looking over his shoulder, wondering who might be the next to disappear. Danny, once calm and composed, became increasingly volatile. Meetings grew shorter, tempers shorter still. The trust that had bound the crew together was breaking apart. Danny ordered the relocation of warehouses, changed communication routes and shut down smaller operations. But none of it stopped the pressure. Every move he made seemed to be predicted. Someone still had eyes inside. The media began catching on to the chaos. Headlines appeared in local papers. Liverpool's hidden mafia under fear, and television news started hinting at a major criminal enterprise under investigation. Detectives refused to confirm the details, but everyone knew who they meant. The Dockside Firm, once invisible, was now front-page news. For a man who had ruled from the shadows, public attention was the worst possible enemy. The National Crime Agency joined forces with Merseyside Police to form a special task force. They called it Operation Hide. Its purpose was clear: dismantle the Dockside Firm from top to bottom. Every suspect, associate and family member connected to Danny Mercer was quietly placed under surveillance. Phones were tapped, bank accounts frozen, and vehicles tracked. Years of secrecy were being undone by technology and patience. As the authorities closed in, Danny's empire started to collapse from within. Some of his men were arrested on minor charges and quickly turned informants to save themselves. One by one, the circle that had once been loyal began to crack. Danny tried to maintain control, but he could feel the city turning against him. Businesses that once relied on his protection stopped answering his calls. People who once greeted him with respect now crossed the street to avoid being seen with him. For the first time in over a decade, Danny was losing power, not through violence, but through fear of exposure. The calm order that had defined the Dockside Firm was replaced by chaos. Mistakes multiplied, deliveries went missing, money dried up. The docks that once served as the foundation of his empire now felt like traps waiting to close. By 2015, it was clear that the golden days were over. The Dockside Firm was no longer an untouchable organization, but a crumbling relic of its own arrogance. Danny Mercer, once the ghost king of Liverpool, now spent his nights in hiding, trying to hold together an empire that was already gone. The betrayal that started it all had grown into something much bigger, a war he couldn't see, a trap he couldn't escape. The fall of the Dockside Firm had begun, and this time, there was no one left to save it. The night Craig Foster's body was found marked the turning point that changed everything for the Dockside Firm. It was early 2016 when police discovered a burned-out car on the outskirts of Liverpool, in an abandoned industrial area near Boot. Inside, the charred remains of a man were identified through dental records as Craig Foster, Danny Mercer's most trusted ally and longtime friend. For over a decade, Craig had been the man who handled the gang's finances, negotiated deals and kept Danny's operations smooth when everything else was fall apart. His death was not only a tragedy but a message. Someone wanted Danny to know that the walls were closing in. The police initially treated the murder as another gang-related killing, but inside the Dockside Firm, panic erupted. The calm structure that once defined their organization completely collapsed. Craig had always been the balance between Danny's cold control and his men's growing fear. Without him, the firm descended into suspicion and silence. Some believed Liam Doyle had returned, seeking revenge for being cut out and hunted. Others whispered that Danny himself had ordered Craig's death, afraid that he was cooperating with police. The truth was lost in the chaos, but one fact was certain: no one in the firm felt safe anymore. Danny became increasingly isolated, rarely leaving his heavily guarded home. He trusted no one, not even the Mills brothers, who had been with him since the early days. Meetings were moved to secret locations, phones were destroyed after single calls, and all cash transactions were done through couriers, who didn't even know who they were working for. What Danny didn't know was that the police were already watching every move he made. Operation Tide had entered its most aggressive phase. Craig's murder gave investigators the opportunity they needed to strike harder. The violence drew national attention, allowing authorities to justify larger raids and deeper surveillance. Behind the scenes, the National Crime Agency planted informants within the lower ranks of the firm. Some of them were men terrified for their lives after Craig's killing, willing to talk in exchange for protection. Bit by bit, the investigation uncovered the firm's hidden structure, tracing money through fake companies and offshore accounts that all pointed back to Danny Mercer. Danny, meanwhile, grew desperate to regain control. He ordered brutal retaliation against suspected traitors, but his actions only added to the body count and strengthened the police case against him. Every attempt to silence a witness, every missing man, and every hidden gun added more evidence to the growing pile of crimes linked to his name. The empire that once thrived on fear was now devouring itself. By the end of 2016, the once mighty Dockside Firm was in ruins. Its leadership was divided, its members scattered, and its reputation shattered. Craig Foster's death had broken the chain that held it all together. What Danny didn't realize was that Craig had been under police watch long before his murder, and his death had opened doors investigators had been waiting to enter. Operation Tide was no longer a hidden effort, it was now a full-scale hunt. The king of Liverpool's Underworld had just lost his crown, and there was no turning back. By 2017, the police had laid the groundwork for the operation that would finally bring the Dockside Firm to its knees. Undercover work had become the key to unraveling Danny Mercer's empire. And the man chosen for the task was an officer named Mark Evans. Posing as a corrupt dock worker, Evans carefully inserted himself into the firm's operations, slowly gaining the trust of its lower-level members. It was dangerous work. One misstep could mean death, and the shadow of Craig Foster's murder hung over every decision. But Evans was meticulous and patient, knowing that a single mistake could jeopardize the entire investigation. For 2 years Evans lived a double life. By day he was the obedient worker, loading and unloading shipments, carrying messages and pretending to be loyal. By night he recorded every conversation, memorized every route, and documented every transaction. Over time, He gained access to sensitive operations, observing shipments of drugs, weapons, and counterfeit currency. He even recorded meetings where large sums of money changed hands, creating a chain of evidence that linked the gang to multiple crimes across Liverpool and beyond. What made Evans' work invaluable was the access he gained to the inner circle. Danny Mercer was notoriously careful about whom he trusted, and very few outsiders ever reached him directly. Yet Evans managed to present himself as indispensable, a man who could get things done without asking questions. Once Danny began relying on him for minor operations, the undercover officer could observe the gang's strategies firsthand. Every instruction, every plan, and every illegal deal was secretly captured, slowly building a case that the police could not ignore. The breakthrough came when Evans secretly recorded a meeting in which Danny discussed Craig Foster's murder. It was not assassin in the traditional sense, but his words implied knowledge and planning, linking him directly to the crime. That single piece of evidence became the key to connecting years of criminal activity to the head of the firm. With this recording, investigators could justify simultaneous raids, knowing they had enough evidence to make arrests and seize assets without tipping off the gang. As Operation Tide moved into its final stage, police prepared for what would become a series of coordinated raids across Liverpool, Manchester, and even parts of Spain, where the firm had hidden assets. The arrests were executed in the early hours of the morning, with officers swooping into warehouses, safe houses, and luxury homes. Men who had once walked the streets as untouchable figures were handcuffed, their cars impounded, and their businesses shut down. The suddenness of the raids sent shockwaves through the city. For Danny Mercer, the operation was devastating. His men, who had once been fiercely loyal, were either arrested or turned informants. The carefully constructed network of shipping routes, banks, and shell companies collapsed almost overnight. The man who had controlled Liverpool's docks with fear and cunning found himself powerless. Every secret, every illicit deal, and every hidden account had been exposed. By the end of 2018, the Dockside Firm was no longer a shadow empire. It was a case study in how even the most meticulous criminal organization could be dismantled from within. Evans's undercover work had provided the evidence necessary to bring Danny Mercer and his closest associates to justice. The empire that once ruled the Liverpool docks in silence had crumbled, proving that no amount of fear, loyalty, or secrecy could protect a criminal mastermind from the long reach of the law. The trial of Danny Mercer and his inner circle began in early 2019, capturing the attention of Liverpool and much of the UK. For years the city had whispered about the unseen power that ruled its docks, and now the world would finally see the extent of that empire laid bare. Courtrooms were packed, journalists lined the corridors, and families of both victims and accused attended every day, waiting for justice. The stakes were enormous, not just for Danny and his men, but for law enforcement who had spent years building the case. The prosecution painted a picture of a criminal empire that operated with precision and cruelty. They detailed how the Dockside Firm controlled Liverpool's ports, smuggling drugs, weapons, and counterfeit goods, while laundering millions through legitimate businesses. Nightclubs, car dealerships, and property investments were all shown as fronts for illegal activity. Evidence gathered by undercover officers, including recordings from Mark Evans, was presented in court, showing Danny directing operations, moving large sums of money, and discussing violent measures against anyone who might betray him. One of the most damning moments came when the audio recording of Danny discussing Craig Foster's murder was played. While it was not a direct confession, it linked him unmistakably to the conspiracy, providing prosecutors with the proof they needed to show his involvement in violent acts within the organization. Witnesses, including former members of the firm who had turned informants, testified in painstaking detail about how Danny ran his empire, revealing the inner workings of a criminal machine that had once seemed untouchable. Their testimonies painted a chilling image of loyalty, fear, and betrayal that kept the gang together for over a decade. The defense attempted to portray Danny as a legitimate businessman, claiming that any illegal activity was conducted by rogue members without his knowledge. They argued that evidence was circumstantial and that law enforcement had exaggerated his involvement. But the prosecution countered with meticulous documentation, bank transfers traced through offshore accounts, intercepted shipments, and undercover recordings showing Danny's direct involvement. The courtroom was filled with tension as each new piece of evidence dismantled the narrative of innocence. Over the months of proceedings, the trial revealed more than just criminal acts. It exposed the psychology of power and control. Danny had ruled with fear, charm, and strategy, creating a loyalty that was almost unbreakable until cracks appeared. The betrayal by Liam Doyle, the murder of Craig Foster, and the eventual cooperation of lower-ranking members all came together to show that even the most tightly controlled empire could fall from within. In the end, the jury found Danny Mercer guilty on multiple counts, including conspiracy to murder, drug trafficking, money laundering, and organized criminal activity. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with no chance of parole for 25 years. The other members of the Dockside Firm received sentences totaling over 120 years collectively, effectively dismantling the gang entirely. The trial closed a chapter on Liverpool's most notorious criminal organization, but the impact of the Dockside Firm's reign continued to ripple through the city. Families affected by their crimes began to find closure, while law enforcement agencies celebrated the dismantling of a highly organized criminal network. The courtroom battle had revealed the dark underbelly of a city that had long hidden in silence, showing that no matter how invisible power may seem, it can always be exposed, challenged, and ultimately defeated. Even after Danny Mercer and his associates were imprisoned, the shadow of the Dockside Firm lingered over Liverpool. The city's streets had begun to recover, but the memory of the gang's control remained vivid in the minds of residents. People still spoke in hushed tones about the docks, the warehouses, and the quiet men who once ruled from the shadows. For many it was a story of fear and survival. For others it was a cautionary tale of ambition and betrayal. The empire that had once appeared untouchable now existed only in memory and court records, but its lessons were etched into the city's collective consciousness. The docks, which had been the center of Danny's operations, were now under heavy surveillance. Cameras, patrols, and stricter regulations made it nearly impossible for similar criminal networks to operate undetected. Police departments shared information across cities, learning from the mistakes that had allowed the Dockside Firm to grow for over a decade. For law enforcement, the downfall of Danny Mercer was not just a victory, it was a blueprint for dismantling organized crime. They understood that empires built on secrecy and fear were always vulnerable to infiltration, patience, and persistence. Among Liverpool's residents, the story of the Dockside Firm became a symbol of resilience. Small business owners who had once feared paying protection money could now operate openly, free from threats. Families that had been silenced by fear spoke out, telling their experiences for the first time. Yet, even as the city moved forward, the psychological impact remained. People were reminded that the rise and fall of power often depends not only on strength, but on loyalty, betrayal, and timing. Danny Mercer himself became a figure of fascination and caution. Media outlets continued to cover his life and crimes, analyzing his strategies, his ruthlessness, and the ways he maintained control for so long. Documentaries, news articles, and books dissected every move he made, exploring the delicate balance between fear, respect, and ambition. To some, he was a villain. To others, a master strategist whose downfall was inevitable. In prisons across the UK, he remained isolated, surrounded by reminders of the life he had lost, unable to influence the world outside. The former members of the Dockside Firm tried to rebuild their lives, but often found the past too heavy to escape. Many had criminal records that made legitimate employment difficult, while others struggled with the consequences of their choices. Some disappeared into obscurity. Others cooperated with authorities in ongoing investigations. The once loyal crew had been fractured, their bonds destroyed by betrayal, arrests, and fear. Despite their absence, the legacy of the Dockside Firm served as a warning to anyone considering a life of organized crime. The empire, built on intelligence, strategy, and intimidation, ultimately fell because of human flaws, greed, jealousy, and mistrust. The story proved that no matter how powerful a criminal organization may appear, internal weakness and external pressure can bring even the strongest empire to its knees. Liverpool moved on, but the memory of the Dockside Firm remained alive in stories, news, and the city's collective memory. The docks were quieter, the streets safer, and law enforcement more vigilant. Yet every so often someone would whisper about Danny Mercer, the man who ruled from the shadows, reminding the city that every empire built on crime carries the seeds of its own destruction. The legend of the Dockside Firm endures, not as a celebration, but as a stark reminder that crime, no matter how sophisticated, cannot last forever.